Well, hello and welcome back to the Preaching While Black podcast, a podcast that focuses on the call, the craft, and the content and context of the Black preaching tradition. In this episode, I got a very special brother with me. I've known him for several years, Christopher Butler, who is a pastor in the Chicago area, but not just a pastor, but also a social organizer. For some reason, Chicago turns out social organizers, and we're going to talk about that in this episode. Looking forward to it. We'll see you guys on the other side.
Welcome to the Preaching While Black podcast, a podcast dedicated to the calling, craft, and content of the Black preaching tradition. And now, here's your host, John C. Richards Jr.
Pastor Christopher, what's going on, brother? How you doing?
Oh, I am doing well, man. How are you, John?
Man, I'm good, man. I'm good. I'm glad to have you on the podcast. For many of you who don't know Pastor Butler, he is a pastor and a social organizer from the South Side of Chicago. Now, you're actually from the South Side. You know, people be like, hey, I'm from the South Side, but they're not really from the South Side.
Yeah, that's for sure. And I am officially from the South Side. I'll be remiss not to say that I was born and raised on the West Side of Chicago.
Okay.
But I've officially lived on the South Side longer than the West Side. So I think I can claim South Side. I do live on the South Side of Chicago.
Yeah. So you're Chicago through and through. So you're married. You have 6 children. Somehow find space and place to not just pastor, but also do some social organizing. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But you also lead a network called Chicago Embassy Church Network, which is a mission-based network of churches there in the Chicago area. You've been a pastor of Chicago Embassy Church since 2016. Yes. And you've also co-authored a book. Many people who are listening in probably have read it. It's called Compassion and Conviction, co-authored with Justin Gibney and Michael Ware. And it's around being able to better engage folks politically in a climate that continues to be more caustic. And we're going to talk about that in this episode. But I want to start with your call, man. Mm-hmm. We love talking about the call to preach. And I'm always intrigued of how pastors arrive to the call to preaching. And I need to talk to you about your call to preach because you've arrived in a place where you're preaching and social organizing. Mm-hmm. How is it that you felt this sense that God was calling you to the proclamation of his word?
Yeah, so it's actually really interesting because I grew up in church. I actually grew up in this church that I actually lead. And I was never really that interested in preaching. You know, I was interested more in singing and doing, and outside of church, I was involved in community organizing from the time I was 12 years old. And so I was kind of oriented as an organizer, as a background person. I mean, and sort of a Linsky style organizer, there's a clear delineation between the leaders and the organizers. And I definitely found myself in the organizer camp and wasn't very interested in preaching. But as I grew up, I found myself really wanting to teach and to train, really wanting to exhort and to encourage, and even sometimes to reprove and edify, to the point where I started asking for opportunities from my pastor to do that on Sundays, but not as a sermon. Like I did not ask to preach, never asked to preach. You know, just after praise and worship, can I be the guy to come and exhort and encourage? If there are opportunities in Sunday school or something like that, can I teach and train? Because I didn't see myself as a preacher. And it was really my pastor, who's also a very close mentor of mine, who started to turn my eye toward, you like to teach, train, exhort, encourage. Like, this is preaching. And maybe you should look into that. And so I started to do that in that time.
So let me ask you this, because I was talking about this the other day with a pastor that I know. We're talking about the distinction between exhortation and preaching. Are those for you two different gifts, or are they one and the same, or they kind of coalesce together?
So I think, that general speaking gift, right, is there, and it's operational in both. And I think there are some necessary proclamation elements of exhortation, right? Because if you're exhorting completely devoid of biblical truth, I don't know if that is really, kind of biblical Christian exhortation. And if your preaching has no exhortation in it, no encouragement in it, there may be some things missing. So I think that there's certainly different emphasis. But I think that there's a little bit of proclamation and exhortation, and a little bit of exhortation and proclamation.
Yeah. So there's a call, right? And then there's a confirmation of the call.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are folks who say they're called to preach, but the other people around them don't necessarily confirm that call.
Yeah.
Question for you: when did you sense the confirmation of that call? I know that it was like, hey, I want to really exhort, but then there was a push by others to get you to preach. When was there a confirmation moment where you were like, you know what? I'm actually called to preach this gospel?
Yeah. So I think I'm around 19 years old. And, like I said, I've been at this point really sitting with Bishop Edward Peacher, who is the founder of Chicago Embassy Church, and a really close mentor. I mean, he really took me under his wings, and, really began to show me his process, really think through what it means to preach. At the same time, in my organizing life, I found myself doing much more kind of training and sort of, stuff on the leadership side, I guess, speaking at events and things like that. And it was in that window when I really began to settle into this idea that preaching may be a part of what I do, like being the person to come up and bring the word, bring the message, begin to settle in. And, I think that confirmation really was gradual from the time I was about 19 years old until the time I was, 22, 23, doing it a few times and having done it, really feeling like this was it, right? Like this is a place where teaching and training, exhortation and encouragement really come together in a way, and feeling fulfilled having preached, I think became the ultimate confirmation.
Yeah. How did your family feel about your call to preach? Some people's families are like, man, I thought you were going to do this. And then other people are like, I saw it the whole time. How'd your family feel about you and your call to preach?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that is interesting is that I was, at 19, in that window of life, I was single, so I didn't have wife and kids and nothing like that to confirm. I think my mother, a lot of people I think were more so like, I more so saw you kind of like going to law school or something like that. I know
Right.
John figured out how to go to law school and preach, so I'm not that clever. But I think my mom definitely was a person who was like, I kind of always saw you going into ministry and preaching. I certainly did not see that for myself. I think a lot of people who I was more involved with on the organizing side were a little bit like, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about that a little bit, because you're called to preach and then you're called to organizing. I wonder if they were parallel, they ran parallel to each other, if there's some cross-sectionality going on there. How did you, at the same time of since you're called to preach, how did you kind of gel that with your call? Because you felt like you were a social organizer and you could do social organizing. How did those feel like they meshed for you?
So I think at first they felt very much in
conflict.
and conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Because I remember, because I guess ultimately, like the ultimate expression of a preacher in my mind, and I'm not saying that this is the case, but when I think about preachers, I think about pastors who lead churches and preach most Sundays out of the year. And I was 100% sure that I was not going to do that. I remember one time, Bishop's wife, Apostle Katie Peacher, we were talking after church, and she was like, "I really see you taking over from Bishop one day." And we were like getting ready to go out the door, John. And I like sat down with her, took my coat off, and we had like a 25-minute conversation, because I was like, I take that very seriously, and I need to explain to you why that will never happen. So and a big part of the reason is that it did feel like, even as an organizer, like a lot of the people who I worked with to organize, get their institutions involved in campaigns and stuff were pastors. I'm like, I don't see how that, like, you either got to be on one side or the other. Like, you can't be both. And I was very much intent on being on the organizer side. And also, to be honest, we, I kind of had a view not only of pastors on the leadership side, but also pastors also on like the broke side, like financially. And I was also dead set on I'm not going to be that either. So,
like, I don't want to be the broke pastor.
Yeah. So this is just not going to work out. That's never going to happen.
It's really interesting, Chris, that you say that you felt that way in Chicago, because Chicago, at least from an outsider's perspective, from those who aren't from Chicago, are like, man, there's so many pastor organizers in the Chicago area, to where you could see quote unquote examples. So it's interesting that you felt that way. It was like they just felt like there was some conflict there.
Yeah. And, you're going down a tricky road for me, John, because let me, living in both of those spaces, and really primarily at this time in the world of politics and organizing, there is, and at that time there was a real sense of like, there's a genuineness to this like spiritual commitment and like genuine, just like sold outness and love for Jesus, right? Like that, and it's still sometimes is, I'm always thinking through this, but like I grew up in a church environment, and just as a person, where it's like being really, really, really in love with Jesus, really, really, really in love with the word, like is so important. And there are times when you are involved with politics and community work where you can have engagements, campaigns, whole relationships with people who are in church, and nothing in your interaction gives you that sense of this hot passion for Jesus Christ. And so
Chris, this is tricky for you to say, but it's not tricky for me to say. There's some politicians who are pastors that don't exhibit the passion and the fruit of the Spirit.
So John said that.
That's just the bottom line. I said that. Y'all can quote me. And I know Chris doesn't want to say that, but I did say that. And it's true, Chris. I think that's very important, especially for pastors and leaders who want to enter politics, because it actually can suck you in, and then you can start become empty of the fruit that you're supposed to exhibit, because the politics becomes primary and the preaching and the life of the fruit of the Spirit becomes secondary.
Yeah. And it's a constant struggle. And so that was one of the reasons that made it tough for me, is because at that early time, I kind of felt like I needed to keep this almost like a bifurcated existence, right? Where, because like in church, like I am that guy that's like crying at the altar, and like, and so it's like, I don't want to ever like, but at that time it's like, I also need to be like a political animal. And at that time, I didn't really, I don't think I thoroughly believed that you could thoroughly do both.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I didn't want to put myself in the position of dishonoring the pulpit by, these things that I will have to do in politics.
Yeah, that makes complete sense, Chris. That makes sense. And I'm glad you shared that. And for any pastor out there who is looking to enter politics, it's something that you definitely want to consider as you're thinking about your call to civic leadership. Civic leadership is a high and noble cause, but it definitely has some low people in the
Yeah.
civic arena. And we got to make sure that as pastors and leaders that we hold up the biblical standard even as we go into pastoral ministry. I appreciate that, man. So we're going to take a break. We'll come back with our next segment. We've talked about your call. Next segment, we're going to talk about your craft. Looking forward to it.
Scholars have referred to the original Black church as the invisible institution because enslaved people were often not allowed to worship freely. They'd have to gather, sing, and preach in secret to avoid being beaten. Yet they still developed a deep devotion to the authority of Scripture and the liberation narrative. Today, many Christians who don't fully agree with conservatives or progressives feel invisible. They're not well represented in politics or mainstream media. In response, the AND campaign has created the Invisible Institution newsletter, or IVI. We'll be providing political commentary, policy breakdowns, and more for Christians who believe in social justice and moral order, not one or the other. Go to andcampaign.org and subscribe if you're sick and tired of feeling invisible.
All right, man. So listen, this is probably one of my favorite segments because I talk about the sermonizing process. Like I love sermon preparation. I love text to sermon processes. I'm always looking to refine my own process. I'm somebody who's very meticulous about my sermon process. Our team at the church will tell you that. They're like, John has 40 pages of exegetical notes on certain passages. I'm just that guy. Yeah. So question for you is, what is your favorite part of the sermonizing process? If you had to pull out one part that was your favorite part.
So before I answer the question, I just have to chime in that is also, that's why I love the Preach My Block podcast. Like I love what you're doing here because I also love to hear from other folks about their process. And so I'm grateful for what you do. So to the question, I think my favorite part is my last step in my process, which is I think a pretty set process, is I have to get a song. If it's really hard for me to preach a sermon that I don't have a song or two. Singing was my first ministry in the church, and I still, do a lot of singing and strumming on my guitar in the office. And so that's when I really know I'm locked in on the sermon, is when I got a song.
So that's your favorite part of the process.
Yeah.
Let's talk about text selection in the process. So I'm going to take you back to the beginning. You got to the end when you talk about the songs. That's great. So let's talk about the beginning. How do you go about selecting your text? Are you a series preacher? What is it? Does the Lord just give you a text each week coming down from heaven like the sheets that Peter saw in the book of Acts? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so I used to. So obviously when I started out preaching, I was not pastoring. At first I was just, an occasional preacher. And so at that point, I kind of did more so pray through like this audience, this place that I'm preaching, this moment of preaching. What does God want to say to these people in this particular moment? And so it was just like, get a text in prayer. And I started off preaching like that when I first started pastoring. And that just is not sustainable.
Can't sustain
at least not for me. Let me not say it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable in my life. And so these days I'm much more of a series preacher. And I try to do in the course of a year, one or two times it'll be more of a topical series, and one or two times it'll be more of a book study or at least a passage section study series.
Why do you feel that's important?
Number one, I think, is sustainability. That was, if I'm honest, that was the thing that drew me in that direction. It's just trying to come up with something completely different to preach every single week. For me, is very hard. I learned very quickly that Sundays keep coming. And
it's around the corner.
It's a very aggressive pace. So that's the first benefit. But as I've been doing it, I recognize that it's much better in my mind for the congregation to be able to process through what is happening in the preaching, right? It's not, especially in my context. I read something, and I'm trying to remember where I read it, but it said pastors think that people come to church to be preached to, but people really come to church to pray and learn how to pray. And so there's a real sense, I think, in the preaching, and at least in my context, where you're also leading a congregation, where you really want people to have time to engage what is being preached and incorporate it into their individual lives and into the corporate life of the congregation. And so if you're bouncing around too much, topic to topic, that becomes, I think, a little bit more difficult to do.
Yeah. And you feel it's important to also provide balance between topical and also book series preaching?
I think so, because I think, for me, and there have been people who have, because I talk to a lot of people and try to allow people to influence. And there are people who are like serious, like, it's got to be, book by book, text by text, preach the whole counsel of God. And I think that is super duper important. And then I've got people like, you got to know where your congregation is. You got to know where the city is. You got to be prophetic, preach to the moment. I haven't said this, but I am a Pentecostal preacher in an AG church. And so there are a lot of folks, you got to be prophetic. You got to speak to the moment. And I think that's important too. And so I think for me, having a balance of that sort of helps cover all of that space.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. So let's talk about your resources. Preachers love resources. We love hearing from resources from other preachers. What would you say are your go-to once you start to enter the text? What are your first resources that you kind of go to kind of glean some understanding from the text?
So I spent a lot of time with the text. So a few different translations, just really reading it. That's kind of like, my overall process is kind of like, I call it an in-out process, because I'm reading the text in, and then I'm going to sketch it out. Then I'm going to study it back in. Then I'm going to write it out in more of a sermon type of a setup. And then I sing it back in, and then I preach it out. So the first, and probably the most important resources is the text itself, and a few different translations. When it is New Testament text, just a little bit of, not like study in like original language, but just like a look at, get some reading in. And then a few translations. I like to look at the English Standard Version. I love to look at the King James, but then I look at the New Living Translation, and then incorporate a few other translations in that read it in process. I don't think I lock into, once I get into the study, I don't think I lock into any particular commentaries. I think I try to do some research about what is most relevant and who has done deep work on the passages that I'm working with at that study phase. So I can't like really be a banner for any particular commentary or something like that. More so for those Bible translations that help me read it in. Those are the consistent resources that I'm using.
Okay. So in terms of like background though, history, cultural background, anything that comes to mind for you in terms of resources that help you to get that, because you're looking at the text, you're diving into the text, original
Hmm.
language, but then there's some background information that we might not necessarily know in our Western context.
Yeah.
As a preacher, what are your resources that you go to and say, hey, I need some of this for the background?
Yeah. So I use my Logos commentary or Logos Bible software.
Yeah.
Um, a few things. I usually find myself looking at like a Bible knowledge series commentary, a pulpit commentary,
Hmm.
but more so, I'm trying to look at um, you know some internet research and reading. I like to read the intro parts of commentaries, and I find myself using a wide number of commentary, mostly because, like, if I'm looking at Luke, something in Luke, I want to get a couple of things where I feel like when I read how um, the person or team that prepared this commentary approached their work, that it
Yeah.
fits what I'm trying to do in the sermon series.
Mm.
And so if that makes sense, there are probably about 15 or 16 different commentaries that cycle through that. But it's really more about, for me, what the work is that went into the commentaries. Because by the
Mm.
time I go to commentary, I want to have like a pretty well-formed idea of what I'm trying to do, especially if I'm preaching New Testament text
That's
where
good.
I
Yeah.
feel like, I'm not getting ready to go anywhere and teach, New Testament or any biblical language, but
Mm.
I do feel like the Lord has been gracious to give me enough resources to do serious work, um,
Mm.
in New Testament text, especially, and so I try to get from reading the text in the English translations and doing some original language work. I try to get an understanding so that when I'm going to commentary, I'm trying to make sure that I'm not like way off the mark. Like I get very afraid if I feel like I discovered something in the text that nobody else has
That
discovered.
nobody else, if nobody else has ever said it, you need to go back to the
Yeah,
text.
yeah. So that's more so the spirit in which
Yeah,
I'm going to the commentary in the first place, and so that's why it's helpful for me then to know how folks approached their
that's right.
work
Hmm.
before I lean too heavily on the work for the sermon.
That's important. I think that a lot of preachers don't necessarily go to the introduction of commentaries to see how the commentators approach their interpretation of the text. And I always tell young preachers too, man, don't dare start with commentaries.
Yeah.
You need to be able to do your own work ahead of time before what you said, Chris. You got to be able to have them confirm what you've already worked on.
Yeah.
And so I've had many young preachers say, hey, I start with this commentary. I'm like, wait a second. Start with the text
Yeah.
and dive into the text. If you need to go anywhere in terms of commentaries, go to historical background
Yeah.
commentaries. So the IVP background commentary. They're not going to give you interpretation. They're going to help you understand the historical and cultural background.
Yeah.
And so that's important for me. I want to make sure that younger preachers heard that from you and heard that from our podcast, because I've seen it too many times where, again, Sunday creeps up on folks. And
Mhm.
so we take shortcuts. We jump straight to
Sure
the
do.
commentary without doing the work ourselves. And it shows in the pulpit
Mhm.
because you haven't internalized the text. You can't preach what you haven't internalized.
Yeah.
And so
And
I appreciate you.
it short circuits I think the larger body of work. Like I also like to see myself and all preachers in a larger community of preaching. And you super value the work that other preachers and commentators have put into it. But if we have a really, really high view of scripture and a real appreciation for just the vastness of like the word of God and the person of God, then we can appreciate that all of us working together are just making contributions into unpacking this infinite life that is like in the Word of God. And so it's not like there's nothing left to see, right? And you can just go read the commentary and
Right.
preach it.
Yeah. So rapid fire here real quick before we go to the content and context of your preaching. Manuscript, outline, or no notes preaching?
Yes. I have gone to the pulpit and do regularly go to the pulpit in any of those modalities. I think sometimes when precision is key for me, and this all is dictated by what the sermon is, right? Like I think that so much of how you preach should be dictated by what you're preaching. And when it's that kind of like word for word precision, I go with the manuscript. When it's kind of when flow is important for me, I go with an outline. And when I guess it's the exhortation, like when hotness is primary, I just try to get it in, and I go without the notes.
That's good, man. So I hope y'all heard that. There's no one way to do it.
Yep.
And Chris is one of those talented preachers who could do it all three ways, just depending on context. But I think that a lot of preachers kind of feel like there may be just one way to go about it, but hearing kind of that multiplicity of ways to go about it is a good thing. Hey, we're going to take a break here. We talked about your call. We talked about your craft. We're going to talk about your content and context of your preacher next. Should be fun. What's up, Preaching While Black fam? Listen, I hope this interview has been a blessing so far. If you want more content and resources around Preaching While Black, go over to our YouTube channel, Preaching While Black. We have all the episodes from our interviews up, but we also have other resources for you as a Black preacher as you try to hone your craft, your call, and your content for Black preaching. Now back to our episode. All right, this is our last segment, man. We're going to talk about the content context of your preaching. Now, we know you're in Chicago. We know you've done some social organizing. What we don't know, what I didn't say, is that Mr. Butler has run for office in the Chicago area. He actually ran for U.S. Senate, 1st District.
Congress.
U.S. Congress, 1st District. So there were, 17 candidates in that field?
17
in this primary field?
That ultimately made the ballot, yes.
Yeah. So it was a packed house.
Yeah.
It was a packed house, and you decided to run as a candidate. And so Chicago has long been a political hotbed. A lot of people hear the name Richard Daley and still shiver.
For sure.
So political machines in Chicago, politicization in Chicago, and Christopher Butler decides he's going to run for office. Why?
So the main reason I decided to run for office, well, I guess the main reason, the overarching reason, was to try to take a lot of what we have been developing in the AND campaign and a few other spaces where I participate, where there is this idea that you can be like thoroughly Christian and really get engaged in civics and politics. And I wanted to take some of that, what we had been developing sort of in the lab and, bring it into the arena, as they say. I hasten to say, because a lot of people who talk to me about the campaign, like they come back and like, it's so great how you ran and, showed up. We got in the race to win. When we first studied the race, it was very winnable because there was an incumbent who was under the surface really weak. And we felt like we could take him out because he was weak under the surface, but a lot of people thought that he was strong and couldn't be beaten. The one thing we felt to do in our pre-campaign analysis was to think about the fact that maybe he knew what was going on under the surface. And so we were running this kind of like stealth campaign to win, but then mid-cycle, the incumbent dropped out. And so when it's an open seat, that changed the whole dynamic. That's when all these other candidates came in. And that changed a lot of the dynamic. I say that, John, because I don't think that you should get into electoral politics primarily to like drive the conversation or bring the, if you get into an election, winning should at least be on the list of things that you can accomplish, because there are other ways to do that other work. So I got in to bring our work into the arena, and I don't want people to think that my campaign means that you can't win in the arena with this approach, because I don't necessarily think that's true.
Yeah. I think that's important for people to understand that when you do decide to run for office, local office, you have to believe that it's a winnable race. Yeah. It's just not for the purposes of making a point or anything to that effect. And a good point that you make, especially for any pastor or leader who may be looking to run for a local office, when you have an incumbent who may have a weakness or may have something that people have some issues with, it makes them someone who may be a viable candidate to run against. Open seats are difficult in local races, especially popular open seats. We didn't talk about how popular this seat is, but popular open seats are going to bring out people out of the woodworks.
Yes.
Who continue to splinter the vote.
Listen, every African-American leader on the south side of Chicago is running for that seat. And
that sounds so familiar. For some reason, we cannot come together in our efforts and support one person. There's always has to be like 500 people who run for the same seat. Yeah. And we had this happen in my hometown. It's a majority black city. And we had 7 black candidates, 1 white candidate, and the white candidate won because of the 7 black. And listen, I don't care what color you are, but one of the black candidates was more qualified than him. It's just that the community split the vote. Yeah. And sometimes I think that, especially in local leadership, black pastoral leadership, we got to lay down our egos and say, hey, who is it that's going to be the most qualified leader in this space? Let's throw our support behind that person. Why can't we do that, Chris?
Well, I think that, one, there have been moments when we were able to do that. I think that 2 things impact this today. Number one, there's not that kind of ongoing organizing work where folks are engaged on a consistent basis in some kind of a coalitional context where we can have those conversations and develop the kind of relationship and trust that it takes to enter into that type of an agreement. Because I don't think it's just laying down our egos. It's also actually being able to come into agreement and trust one another, that we can work together in this way. And that type of work is not happening. The other thing is that we are living in a very kind of ionized and fractionated society, so that our interest, when you really start to have conversation, our location geographically and our kind of ethnic identity does not necessarily mean that we have the same political interest, and that also.
In other words, let me translate that. So you spoke the Greek. I'm going to go ahead and translate it into King James. All skin folk ain't kinfolk.
You hear me what I say. And so
I hear you.
It presents a real unique challenge. I think it's one of the things that we really have to be thinking about in local politics and leadership all the way up to the national level, is that this is not a world where there's just Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and progressives or liberals or whatever. There's a lot of it's kind of a multipolar environment, and we got to think about what that means in terms of coalition and power.
That's good, man. So let's talk to the preacher who is listening to this, who really wants to get involved civically. They understand the history and impact of the Black church. They've read Compassion and Conviction. They've seen the work that you've done in the Chicago area. And they're saying, hey, Chris, how is it that I can start the process of becoming more active in my local community and potentially run for local office?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is, because I think in this day, your how and your why is way more important than the what. And there's this John Piper quote that I've adapted, because Piper says missions exist because worship doesn't. And I also think that justice work exists because worship doesn't, right? And so just be a worshiper of God, a lover of Jesus, as you go into any space. And you got to be really, really rooted in that so that it remains primary, because there are a lot of prizes in politics, and and it's not just elected office. I mean, there are a lot of prizes, and so you really have to prize Jesus. Once you got that square, my thing is find the issue that you're concerned about, and show up, right? Show up to serve, show up to a meeting. People are always looking for a volunteer, somebody to help write something, say something, pull a meeting together, bring coffee and donuts. Like there are lots and lots of ways to plug in. And I think the first step is doing that, just showing up in a spot and filling a need, whether it be service oriented or more sort of direct political engagement. That's what you do to get involved. You show up.
That's good, man. So 2024, we're recording this. Now, this is probably one of the most monumental federal election years in a long time. It's going to determine, I've just read King's Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community. I think those two are on the board for us.
Yeah.
As we look at the political landscape. As a pastor, preacher, leader, how are you preparing your people for election day 2024?
Yeah, so I think it's a 2-track process that we're engaging. One is really, we're drawing on some of the resources that we're creating even inside the AND campaign. So we're doing, the civic disciplines and the civic revival, and really talking to people about the importance of engagement, doing some of the things that we do every election year: voter registration, opportunities for voter education. The second track, though, is that kind of worship track, to understand that politics is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly important, but it is not ultimate. Who leads the United States, who controls the Congress, and all those types of things. These are not questions without significance, but we are called to a higher kingdom, and we're sustained by a higher authority and power. And so we cannot feel wherever we fall on the political spectrum. And I have this interesting thing, because I lead in an Assembly of God church, and so we have a fairly politically diverse group.
Yes,
in the congregation, and so I'm always saying, if your side wins, you cannot feel this sense of ultimate victory, because that's not the fight. And if your side loses, you cannot feel this sense of ultimate defeat, because that's not the fight. So we got to keep our eyes on what is ultimate, eternal, and most significant, while we work really, really hard in civics and politics, because that's very, very important.
That's a good word, Ben, and that's a good word for us to close on. Pastor Chris, I'm elated that you were able to join me in this episode. I'm looking forward to the work that you can continue to do there in Chicago as leading a church, and also through your social organizing. And my prayer is that God will continue to use you mightily through the AND campaign and other pieces to help people understand that Jesus and justice go together. Looking forward to seeing you guys on the other side. Thank you all for joining us for the Preaching While Black podcast, where we discuss the call, the craft, and the content of the Black preaching tradition. Make sure you follow us on social media. We have Facebook, we have Instagram. Make sure you're liking all our stuff, following our stuff, and also sharing our stuff with other preachers who need these specific resources. We have more resources on the way for you all. We're going to be doing some preaching, expository preaching outlines. We're going to also share some illustrations with you all. And I'm going to do a Logos Bible software training from text to sermon. I got a deep process that I go through. Looking forward to sharing that with you all. All right, y'all. We'll see y'all on the other side. Grace and peace.
Thanks for listening to the Preaching While Black podcast. For more helpful content and resources, connect with us online at preachingwhileblack.com.